The conflict itself was a joke played on geography, an arbitrary line drawn in the dirt that cost more blood than any landmass was worth. In war, you cease to be Elias Thorne. You are merely Eli, a component in a failing machine, a numerical error that must be corrected. I learned this looking at the casualty reports, not just the staggering totals, 271,300, a number rounded for the convenience of statisticians, but the deliberate blank space where the names of the missing should have been. The records always simplified the loss, treating life like arithmetic. But I knew numbers lied. I fought because the alternative was worse. Life under the roof of my father. He was the tyrant I hated. The man who used his fists and his laughter to break me, who turned my mother's devotion into a spectator sport of his cruelty. The army was my sanctuary. 7 months of rigid discipline that replaced the chaotic terror of home. I didn't care what flag I served under. I only cared that his shadow couldn't reach me there. I was 20. I was deployed with the 14th Infantry Regiment 2nd Division, a unit the UN would later erase from history. We called ourselves the Fury Squad. There were 7 of us, but in truth only one man mattered, Sergeant Silas Vane. Vane was a cold, chiseled statue of a man, Hollywood's worst stereotype of a battle-hardened veteran made flesh. We feared him more than the enemy artillery, but that fear was tinged with an inexplicable reverence, as if he represented some ultimate, necessary truth about survival. We knew nothing about his past, except that his eyes, when they held yours, felt less like eyes and more like polished obsidian mirrors, reflecting only your own impending doom. Our sharpshooter was Juno Whisper Han. Before deployment, Juno was all talk and vibrant energy, but on the line he was a silent, lethal focus, a mask of concentration. Then there was Caleb Moss, the youngest, barely 19, enlisted because his father forced him. I felt a kinship with Caleb, a fellow victim of parental tyranny, and took him under my wing. The twins were Rorik and Rydian Flint. They were quiet, almost interchangeable, save for the nervous tick Rydian had in his left eye. Finally, there was Torin Vane, the sergeant's son. Torin never spoke. He just watched, his stillness more unnerving than the sergeant's stare. I used to envy him, believing Vane treated his son with the respect he never showed us. The Vane's lullaby. Our first mission in March 1951 ended in a brutal retreat. Explosions ripped the concrete reinforcements we clung to. The sun was falling, bleeding orange across the muddy landscape. Above the cacophony of mortars, I heard Sergeant Vane's voice, devoid of panic. Break off. Fall back. It made no sense. Our battalion was being shredded. We should have been fighting to the last man. Yet no one hesitated. We were soldiers, but Vane was authority defined. We jumped over the barricade. Juno, ever the focused marksman, was the last to move. Come on, Whisper. Let's go. I yelled in English, the language we used out of habit to intercept enemy chatter, a habit Vane had ruthlessly instilled. Juno turned, ducking, but it was already too late. 2 rounds tore through the sandbags and slammed into his pelvis. He collapsed, clutching his lower body, a gush of viscous, bright red blood instantly pooling beneath him. Rorik, Caleb, and I rushed to him. Torin Vane, however, stood unmoving, his gaze fixed on the crimson stain spreading across the mud, his expression utterly blank. Torin, get the stretcher, Rorik shouted. Torin did not move. He was a statue of perfect apathy. I waited for Sergeant Vane to unleash his famous fury, to strike his own son for disobedience. But Vane did nothing. He stood, arms crossed, tapping his boot in the mud, observing. We had to lower Juno into the cold muck. His screams were muffled, guttural. I can't move my legs, Eli. I can't feel anything below the waist. We ripped his tunic open. 2 clean, terrible holes. One high on the abdomen, the other low in the groin. We bandaged him clumsily, struggling to lift our friend who was now a dead weight of agony. All the while, Torin stared at the blood. Then Vane approached. The air temperature seemed to drop. He pulled Rydian Flint aside, handing him a T-38 carbine. "Shoot him, Rydian." Vane's voice was soft, conversational, yet the words felt carved from ice. A small, traitorous part of me wanted Rydian to obey, to end the horror and the pain. But another part, the human core, screamed against the command. "Sir, Sergeant, I can't do that," Rydian stammered, his nervous eye tick suddenly violent. Vane's lips, normally a thin, rigid line, twisted into a frown of pure disappointment. He tore the weapon from Rydian's hands and shoved it into the hands of his twin. "Rorik. You, Rorik. Do you defy the very principle of war?" Rorik's face, usually the mirror of his brother's, went utterly still. The eye tick vanished. He stared straight ahead, clutching the carbine until his knuckles turned white. He broke his gaze from the nothingness and looked at his twin, tilting his head like an animal assessing prey. Then he looked at Juno, who was weeping in shock and pain. He raised the gun. His voice was a flat, chilling echo of compliance. "As the Vane commands, sir." Rorik pulled the trigger. 4 rounds slammed into Juno's chest, ending the sound of his pain forever. Rorik dropped the carbine back into Vane's waiting, gloved hand. His face was a mask of unblemished, horrifying calm. Vane smiled, a sharp, hungry stretch of his lips, and spoke the sentence that would haunt my dreams. "A piece of decaying meat serves only the worms." We left Juno unburied. The sun was swallowed by the black branches of the woods. Under Vane's lead, we hiked into the dark, wet forest, supposedly to set up a long defense line. I was too consumed by blinding fury toward both Vane and Rorik to speak. Vane eventually ordered us to halt and make a fire. While Caleb and I unpacked the tinned rations, Rorik and Torin went to gather wood. Vane announced he would accompany them to ensure Torin earned his supper. With the sergeant gone, the silence between Caleb and me was suffocating. We stared at Rorik, who was calmly unwrapping the porridge tins, his eyes utterly blank. The murder was not just impossible to forget. It was sitting right next to us. The rage I felt for Rorik was a pure, visceral feeling I hadn't experienced since I lived with my father. "What the hell, Rorik?" I sputtered, the English cutting through the tension. "How could you do that? He was your squad, your friend." Rorik didn't look up. He stirred the thin gruel. "Because he told me to. I don't care what Vane said. You killed him." Somewhere in the distance, a shell hit the earth, sending a deep, resonant crack through the canopy. I was so busy screaming that I didn't see Caleb, quiet and shaking, pick up one of the jagged river stones we'd gathered for the fire pit. Before I could react, Caleb was on him. The rock smashed down on Rorik's jaw with a sickening crunch. Down, up, down. The rhythmic smashing was the only sound, until there was nothing left of Rorik's face but bone shards, blood, and pulp. I pulled Caleb back, wrapping my arms around him as he curled into a fetal position, sobbing uncontrollably. I couldn't control it," he whimpered, tears mixing with the dirt on his face. "It's my father. He did the same thing. He killed my neighbor, my friend, for nothing. Just the senseless murder. It reminded me of her." Caleb choked on a wave of remorse. "I killed 5 enemy soldiers today, Eli. 6 now. I've killed my own squad. I think I'm becoming him." I hugged him tightly, the blood from Rorik's corpse staining my tunic. I wanted to tell him it was all right, but the words felt hollow. I looked down at Rorik's shattered body. I should have felt remorse, but instead, there was a terrible, dangerous satisfaction. The rage was gone, replaced by a hollow emptiness. I crouched down and began, mechanically, to restack the stones for the fire pit. The planes had stopped. Absolute silence. The parasites' demand. We had the fire lit long before Vane and Torin returned. They materialized from the blackness, not walking, but simply being there. I noticed two things instantly. Vane was the only one carrying wood, and Rorik was not with them. Vane dropped the bundle of logs by the pit. Thorne sat opposite Caleb and me, his eyes landing instantly on Rorik's corpse. Thorne observed the mutilated remains for a moment, then turned and looked directly at Caleb. He knew. Before I could process how he knew, Sergeant Vane walked up to me and handed me his T-38. He didn't have to speak. I knew the command. Caleb knew the command. Thorne merely watched. I held the carbine. It felt solid, weighted with an aura of death, and in my hands, it felt like power, like the absolute right to decide fate. I thought of my father, his beatings, his laughter, the degradation. I wondered if he felt this sense of final, terrible dominion. I looked at Caleb's pleading, terrified eyes. All the rage, the suffering, the abuse I had endured throughout my life, culminated in this singular moment. I looked at Vane and saw my father's essence, the pure, commanding evil of him. And then, just like Rorik, I heard the chilling, quiet echo of compliance leave my own lips. As the Vane commands, sir. I pulled the trigger without hesitation. The bullet struck Vane's nose, turning his face into a grotesque, dripping hole. I let the rifle drop into the mud. An extraordinary feeling washed over me. A searing pang of guilt, a stab of remorse, was instantly overwhelmed by a fantastic, blinding sensation of joy. A deliverance. I had rid the world of everyone's pain. I was embedded, relieved, and happy. The feeling vanished as soon as I stared at the man I had just killed. My sergeant. I dropped to my knees in shock. I could only stare at my own callous, blood-flecked hands and weep. Don't cry, soldier. The voice was Thorne Vane. I looked up, expecting horror from Caleb, but Caleb was staring straight ahead, fixed on something unseen behind Thorne. Thorne, the son of the man I had just executed, stood up and calmly lit a match, tossing it into the tinder. There is no need to feel regret over anything that happened today, Thorne said, his voice now a low, resonant baritone that had never been heard before. War warrants the taking of life. We kill because we see it as right. The dead did not deserve their lives. I noticed Caleb reaching for a pile of discarded T-99 rifles. But killing is so much more than that, Thorne continued, the fire beginning to catch, casting dancing shadows. Killing is necessary for survival. And killing is the only punishment people will truly learn from. It is the ultimate expression of dominance. Caleb loaded the magazine. And killing? Thorne smiled. A terrifying predatory smile that revealed glistening pointed teeth. Is merciful for both the victim and the one holding the gun. Caleb's expression was a mixture of horror and realization. What the hell are you talking about, Thorne? The fire bloomed. The sudden light illuminated Thorne. His skin was pale, almost translucent. His eyes were perfectly, unnaturally black, swallowing the light. Veins the color of stagnant green poked through his thin skin. I think you, of all people, know what I'm talking about, Caleb. The entity replied, its voice deepening, echoing with multiple timbres. Killing releases the monsters inside all of us. Or rather, it releases the Vane. And with that final word, Caleb turned the rifle towards his own face, his eyes wide with utter surrender. The phrase slipped out, a final, despairing gasp of compliance. As the Vane commands, sir. He pulled the trigger. The entity, the Vane, which had worn the skin of Thorne, melted back into the dense shadows before Caleb's body hit the ground. I buried them all, Caleb and Rorik together, and Vane to the left of the pit. I watched the dawn, the first rays of light catching a single green leaf that fluttered down into the diminishing flames, curling up in the heat. I left my equipment, my uniform, my rifle, everything. I walked in a straight line, away from that place, away from whatever entity or madness had been among us. I didn't know where it went, or if it was still there. I didn't care. I eventually retreated south, using my English to settle into the occupied territory. They called me a veteran, but I fought in the Korean War for a single terrible day. I fought the Vane all my life, and I haven't stopped fighting since. I fought the Vane all my life, and I haven't stopped fighting since. The problem with peacekeeping is the presumption of peace. There is no peace, only a momentary lull in the madness. In 1994, I was Captain Jasper Rook Cole, attached to a small, multinational contingent sent into the heart of Rwanda. We weren't peacekeepers. We were grave watchers, assigned to a sector the UN seemed happy to forget. I carried the weight of my Canadian-Belgian heritage, a painful internal conflict between duty and apathy, and the desperate hope that perhaps, by witnessing the worst of humanity, I might purge some deep, unnameable fear within myself. Our forward operating base was a dilapidated church compound, and our mission was to monitor the safety of a handful of forgotten villages. My team consisted of 3 people. Major Ilera Echo Vance, our commander, a pragmatic woman who still believed in the rulebook, even when the world around us was being shredded by machetes. Private Leo Lion Dubois, a massive, quiet man whose physical strength was only matched by his profound belief in God. He never complained, but his eyes were always full of unshed tears. Sergeant Anya Ghost Petrova, a Russian former medic, now a logistics expert, cold, hyper-efficient, and possessing an unnerving ability to move without making a sound. We were already weeks into our deployment when the radio silence from the village of Kikukiro confirmed our worst fears. The gray silence. We took the 2 remaining Humvees and drove out, the humid air thick with the smell of wood smoke and something acrid, like burnt sugar. The closer we got to Kikukiro, the more profound the silence became. No dogs barked. No children cried. Even the jungle seemed to hold its breath. Major, the trees look sick, I radioed to Ilera, who was driving the lead vehicle. The forest flanking the narrow dirt track was healthy, but every 3rd or 4th tree was covered in a thin, gray patina, like a coat of dust that refused to be washed away by the relentless equatorial rain. When we finally reached the clearing, Kikukiro was a nightmare tableau. The huts were intact, but the ground was littered with bodies. Not the mutilated victims of the interethnic violence we had grown accustomed to. These were something else entirely. Leo slammed the brakes. Oh God, this isn't Hutu or Tutsi. This is wrong. The bodies were rigid, contorted, their skin a uniform, horrifying shade of pale gray. But the true horror was the growths. From the corners of their eyes, their nostrils, and sometimes erupting from the back of their necks, grew fine, silvery gray fungal strands, thin as spider silk. They pulsed faintly in the suffocating heat. It looked as if a parasitic, crystalline mold had consumed their vitality. Major Vance, pragmatic to the end, pulled on a pair of thick rubber gloves. Chemicals, or bioweaponry. Anya, set up the Deccan station. Cole Dubois, search for survivors. Do not, under any circumstances, touch the growths. The Void's gift. We moved through the huts, each one a sealed crypt containing a final, silent scene of terror. In one small, dark structure near the center of the village, Leo stopped abruptly. Jasper, in here. His voice was a strained whisper. The air inside was thick and metallic. Lying on a woven mat was a woman, her skin marbled gray, the fungal strands beginning to weave around her hair. But she was moving. She was in labor. She let out a low, guttural noise that sounded less like a human cry and more like the scrape of dry leaves. It's too late for the mother, Anya said, appearing silently behind us, her face pale. The infection has reached the central nervous system. But the baby? I started, kneeling down, the smell of bodily fluids and putrefaction making my stomach heave. Help me, Jasper, the woman rasped in French, her eyes rolling back to show only grayish white. I coached her, urging her to push. Leo stood guard, his rifle shaking. After a desperate struggle, the baby slid out. It wasn't a monstrous twin or a malformed infant. It was a perfectly still, perfectly white, sightless entity. Its skin was like bleached parchment, and where the eyes should have been were smooth, closed sockets. It made no sound. It was the absolute, unblemished void in the shape of a child. The mother stared at it, her last remaining moment of consciousness focused entirely on this awful absence of life. Her expression was not pain, but a deep, profound revulsion. She died with her lifeless gaze fixed on me, a look that said, "You brought this horror. You are responsible." We retreated. We didn't bury the dead or the child of the void. We fled the gray silence, the image of that blind, white figure seared into my memory. The fungus takes root. We were speeding back down the dirt track when the ambush hit. It wasn't organized militia. It was a desperate, chaotic frenzy. Major Vance, leading the convoy, took the first hit. Not a bullet, but a rocket-propelled grenade from an unseen position. The Humvee exploded in a blinding flash of fire and shrapnel. The last sight I had of Major Vance was her head disappearing into the inferno. Private Dubois and I jumped out, returning fire. We raced toward the relative cover of the jungle line. Then disaster. Leo didn't step on a mine. He stumbled into a puddle of viscous, gray-white slurry hidden by dense ferns. He yelled, not in pain, but in sheer terror. "My leg! I can't feel my leg, Jasper. It's cold." I turned and saw it. The slurry was the same color as the fungal growths, and it was climbing Leo's boot, eating into the leather. Leo frantically ripped off his boot and sock. Where his skin had been exposed to the substance, it was already turning a dead, uniform gray. "It's the Vane, Jasper. It is consuming me," Leo shrieked, collapsing into a violent, full-body seizure. Before my eyes, the gray spread up his leg, racing across his torso. Then the grotesque realization. Fine, shimmering silver threads, the fungal strands, began to erupt from his tear ducts and the corners of his mouth, quickly weaving a delicate, terrifying shroud over his face. I pulled out my combat knife, ready to amputate, but it was too late. Leo stopped seizing. He was a gray statue, his life force seemingly siphoned away by the microscopic invasion. As I stared, horrified, a gunshot snapped me out of my trance. The enemy fire was closing in. I had to move. I scrambled to pull Leo's body to safety, but in my haste, I slipped on a wet rock. I fell, and a shard of metal from the destroyed Humvee tore a clean, shallow line across my left forearm. I barely registered the pain, but I saw the gray slurry splash onto the wound, dissolving instantly into the blood flowing from the cut. "Anya!" I screamed into the radio. "Dubois is down. I'm exposed. Where are you?" Silence. Only the faint, almost musical sound of the fungal strands vibrating in the now-dead air. Sergeant Petrova was gone, swallowed by the chaos, or perhaps by something else entirely. The fever hit immediately, a blast of white-hot agony that brought me to my knees. The world tilted. I fought to stay conscious, raising my rifle to fend off the closing enemy forces. I saw the flash of the militia through the trees, their weapons raised. But I didn't see the militia's final blow. Just as I raised my rifle, a towering, gaunt silhouette stepped out from behind Leo's corpse. It had no definite shape, merely the suggestion of skeletal structure, a thing of shadow and bone. It stood over Leo, and I watched, paralyzed by the fever, as it appeared to gently pluck the fungal strands from Leo's face, consuming them with an awful, quiet satisfaction. It was feeding. The thing looked up, its face a swirling vortex of shadows, and then it lunged. I saw no bullet, felt no impact. I only felt the darkness closing in, and the last coherent thought I had was a chilling certainty. I wasn't killed by the enemy. I was claimed by the Vane. I wasn't killed by the enemy. I was claimed by the Vane. They say that history is written by the victors. I say that history is written by those who survive long enough to forget the true price. My name is Dr. Adrian Sterling. For the better part of 2 decades, I have been a collector of nightmares, a historian specializing in the psychological trauma of early 20th century conflicts. I was preparing a collection of stories from the Great War, seeking the raw, untainted truth beneath the polished medals and patriotic tributes. I had gathered many accounts, tales of loss, mustard gas, and the grinding futility of trench warfare. But one story stood out, not for its tragedy, but for its sheer impossibility. It belonged to Colonel Phineas Blackwood. He wasn't merely old. He was ancient, a relic from a world that had burned itself to ash and reformed without him. At 110, he resided in a quiet nursing facility, his mind sharp but his eyes perpetually shadowed by something seen a century ago. He hadn't sent a written account. He demanded I meet him in person. When I arrived, his carer introduced us and discreetly withdrew. Blackwood's hand, papery and cool, gripped mine with surprising strength. He sat in a leather armchair, perpetually swirling a tarnished military canteen, the rhythmic clinking of the ice inside the only sound besides the grandfather clock. I knew it wasn't water inside. "You seek the truth of the war, doctor?" he rasped, his voice like dry autumn leaves being crushed. "The truth is not in the trenches. It is in the mirror. War doesn't create monsters. It simply finds them a suitable environment." I asked him about the story. A flicker of genuine terror crossed his face, a look I'd only ever seen in shell-shocked veterans 40 years younger. I offered to stop, but he shook his head, fixing me with an intense, desperate stare. "Someone has to know," he whispered. "Word for word, doctor. This is exactly what happened." The obsidian mirror. In the weeks leading up to the Great Offensive, going over the top, as we called it, my life was the trench. Mud, damp wool, and the constant nagging threat of German mortar fire. I was a young officer, and the men depended on me for morale. The week before the jump was mundane, except for the arrival of a new recruit, Private Thomas Sterling. He was barely a man, innocent and full of misplaced trust. He followed me everywhere, trying to talk, trying to find reassurance in my command. I found his faith exhausting. Finally, I retreated to my makeshift bunk for sleep. The dream began instantly. I was back in the trench, but the night was unnaturally still. The sky was wrong. There were no stars, no ambient light from flares or fires. The only illumination came from a colossal lunar eclipse, casting a sickly, pale red glow over the blasted, barren land. It was the color of old, dried blood. I moved to the next section of the trench, and that's when I heard the sound. Not a shell, not a rat, but a wet, sickening, stretching noise. I stopped. There was another soldier in the dark. It was me. He was dressed in my uniform, bore my rank, and wore my face. He was an obsidian mirror reflecting my own terror. "Do you know, Phineas?" the other me said, his voice deep and echoing. "What war truly turns humanity into?" Before I could answer, the transformation began. His skin didn't tear. It stretched. Massive, jagged spikes of pure bone began to protrude from his spine and shoulders, punching through the flesh with impossible speed. Yet he made no sound of pain. His hands twisted, elongating into razor-sharp, yellowed claws. It was a figure utterly impaled by its own biology, a horrific anatomical tragedy, but it still wore my face, looking at me with a detached, cold curiosity. I named it then, in my mind, the parasite of the eclipse. I woke up, gasping. Private Thomas Sterling was standing over me, his face a picture of innocent concern. I waved him off, telling him it was just a nightmare, that we had far more important things to fear. The immediate reality proved me wrong. A colossal explosion sounded just outside our lines. The Germans were shelling us again. I scrambled out, shouting for Thomas to follow. When the shelling finally stopped, we assessed the damage. Minimal casualties, thankfully, but Thomas was shaking violently. He pointed to something peculiar etched into a sandbag that had been ripped open by shrapnel. He handed me a piece of old, ripped paper. It was an envelope that must have been buried for months. Written on the paper, in elegant, looping script, were the words, "You are already known." We brushed it off as a grim joke or a misdirected note, but the unsettling feeling lingered. For the next few nights, the dreams returned. The parasite, Eclipse, would just observe me, never attacking, always under that same awful lunar glow. I felt like a specimen under glass. The final cut. The horror reached its zenith on the last night before the offensive. I was standing in an empty, infinite white space with Eclipse. Today, the entity hissed, its voice a dry rattle of bone. "You learn what service truly means to a man. You and I, Phineas, we share a deep connection you cannot comprehend." When I demanded an explanation, it simply smiled, revealing a row of needle-sharp teeth that hadn't been there before, and began to walk away. It spoke one word, a quiet, damning accusation. "Sterling." The next day we were ordered over the top. The noise was deafening. The air choked with iron and smoke. Thomas Sterling and I charged side by side, but the explosions and machine gun fire quickly isolated us from the rest of the battalion. We found ourselves deep in the shattered remnants of a forest. That's when I saw it. Massive, three-pronged scratch marks raked deeply into the trunk of a dying beech tree. Marks far too large to be made by any animal. And then I looked up. The parasite of the Eclipse was standing 20 yards away, a grotesque sentinel in the shadows, staring directly at us. I turned to ask Thomas if he saw it, but the boy was gone. Just a moment before, he was right next to me, breathing heavily. Now nothing. Then, a faint cry for help from deeper within the woods. "Phineas! Over here!" It was Thomas. I plunged into the dense, dark woods, searching frantically. I didn't find Thomas. I found Eclipse. Charged me, its skeletal spurs tearing through the air. Pure adrenaline took over. I raised my rifle, aiming directly at its familiar yet monstrous face. I closed my eyes, braced for the impact, and squeezed the trigger. The loud, flat bang of the rifle was followed by an agonizing silence. I slowly reopened my eyes. Eclipse was gone. Lying on the muddy ground where the creature had stood was Private Thomas Sterling. His uniform soaked crimson. A single bullet hole blossomed directly over his lung. He was drowning in his own blood. I tried desperately to help him, to staunch the flow, but it was hopeless. I was sobbing, shaking, screaming his name, but all the sounds seemed trapped in my throat. Then, I looked at my reflection in the pool of Thomas's blood. My face, usually pale, was now contorted in a terrifying, predatory smirk. My reflection, the Vane's reflection, dipped its hand into the fresh, hot blood, smeared it across its mirrored face like war paint, and whispered, the sound vibrating not in the air, but directly inside my skull. "You chose its home. My work is done. I've learned what war does to a man, Doctor, and one day you will too." The old colonel slumped back, utterly spent. He stared into his canteen, no longer swirling the whiskey. I left his home in a stunned silence. I drove home as quickly as possible, trying to process the triple layer of horror. The officer's testimony, the murder of his innocent recruit, and the eerie coincidence of the name, Thomas Sterling, mirroring my own name, Adrian Sterling. I parked the car in my driveway. I was about to open the door when I noticed something scratched into the passenger side window. It wasn't a key scratch. It was deep, three-pronged, and deliberate. A chill, profound and sickening, ran down my spine. The message was simple, intended only for me, the historian who collected the nightmares of others. The final message read, "The Vane sees you. I stared at the three-pronged scratch mark on my car window until the glass went blurry and my knuckles were white against the steering wheel. It wasn't a warning. It was a signature. The Vane had found its way from the trenches of 1917, through the frozen hills of Korea, and the burning jungles of Rwanda, right to my quiet, suburban driveway. I, Dr. Adrian Sterling, was no longer a collector of nightmares. I was now part of the collection. The collective word count of the previous chapters was around 9,000 words. This final part will conclude the narrative, aiming to round off the story at the requested length. The collector's dossiers. The message, "The Vane sees you," did two things. It shattered my rational world and focused my entire being. I had to know if the connection was merely coincidence or something far more sinister. I needed the missing pieces, the Korean War survivor and the UN peacekeeper. Using every resource a historian specializing in conflict trauma could access, disgraced military records, sealed psychiatric reports, and deep web archives, I found them. Dossier 1, Elias Thorne. Conflict, Korean War, 1951. Disposition. Officially listed as missing in action, presumed dead. Reality, Eli Thorne became a ghost. He lived as an isolated hermit in northern Canada, near the Arctic Circle, surviving on minimal contact with the outside world. His occasional panic journal entries were leaked online by a misguided social worker. The pattern: his writings were not about the enemy. They were rambling, obsessive manifestos about the cold, empty eyes of Sergeant Vane and the compulsion to violence. He was still fighting the desire to obey the final command. Dossier 2, Captain Jasper Rook Cole. Conflict, Rwanda Intervention, 1994. Disposition. Rescued, but medically discharged due to severe PTSD and an unidentified cutaneous necrosis, skin death, on his left arm. Reality, Cole was housed in a maximum security psychiatric facility in Belgium. He was withdrawn, rarely spoke, and compulsively carved the same pattern, 3 deep, raking lines, into the walls of his cell with his fingernails. He often talked to an invisible thing he called the fungus. The patterns were undeniable. The Korean War had psychological consumption, Vane commands. Rwanda had biological consumption, the fungus. The Great War had spiritual consumption, eclipse/parasite. It was the same entity, evolving its method of infection across conflicts. I knew I was running out of time. My own sleep was now plagued by dreams of a red, sickly eclipse and the faint, cold scent of decay. The scratch mark on my window had begun to faintly glow under the moon. The simultaneous confessions. I spent 3 days locked in my home office, refusing to eat or sleep. I managed to set up a simultaneous encrypted communication line, one attempting contact with Eli Thorne's remote satellite phone, and the other a clandestine scheduled call with Dr. Alistair Finney, Jasper Cole's current therapist, whom I had convinced I was a fellow researcher. It was 2 a.m. The air in the room was stale, thick with the metallic smell of old fear. The call connected. Transmission from Eli Thorne, Korean War 1951. Eli Thorne's voice, when it finally cracked through the static, sounded like dry paper. He was terrified, but perhaps also relieved to finally speak the truth. "You found me. The Vane. You know the Vane. It was never Silas. It was the principle of command. It was the absolute right to destroy. My father had it. Vane had it. And when I killed him, I had it. It doesn't care about the war, Doctor. It cares about the choice to kill your own kind. When Rorik shot Juno, when Caleb murdered Rorik, when I murdered Vane and Caleb, we all surrendered. We said, as the Vane commands. It's the final surrender of the soul, the realization that true freedom is the freedom to destroy." I pressed him about the entity he saw. Torin. Torin was the vessel, the body. The Vane is the whisper, the compulsion. It jumps. It moves to the person who commits the most profound, most personal act of betrayal or violence. It's the psychic parasite, Doctor. It needs the host to choose to be the monster. He paused. A long, shivering silence. It's back now. I see its reflection in the ice. It wants me to finish the work. It wants me to join the void. It's whispering its lullaby. Do you hear it? His voice suddenly dropped to a chilling, placid monotone. The ultimate surrender. As the Vane commands, Doctor, I must apologize. I'm tired of fighting. The line went dead with a soft click. I heard what sounded like a single, distant gunshot, then nothing. Transmission from Dr. Finney, Rwanda 1994. No sooner had Eli's line cut out than Dr. Finney's rushed, frantic voice burst through the receiver. Dr. Sterling, thank God. Something is happening to Cole. I don't know what you call the Vane, but it's real. He stopped speaking entirely. He's been staring at his arm. Finney's voice broke into a terrified gasp. The fungal patch, the necrosis. It's spreading. It's silver, crystalline. And it's not just on his skin. It's growing on the walls, on the bedsheets. It's like a silver cobweb, and it's moving toward him. I grabbed my pen. Finney, listen to me. You have to check his mouth. Is he saying anything? He is, but he's not speaking English. It's a guttural, wet sound like something being torn. And he's smiling, Dr. Sterling. He's smiling with pure malice. Finney screamed. Oh my God! The fungus, the strands. They're coming out of his eyes. They're long, like feelers. He's dissolving. It's consuming him. I could hear the doctor's ragged breathing, followed by a wet, sucking sound, and then a dry, multi-layered voice that resonated with the same emptiness I'd heard in the Colonel's dream. The voice of the parasite, fungus Vane. The home is clean. The nutrient has been absorbed. The line went dead again. The final cut. The realization hit me with the force of a mortar shell. Elias Thorne, mind the Vane is a psychic entity that uses the will to destroy as its vector, compelling the host to commit the final, cleansing act of violence. Jasper Cole, body the Vane is a biological entity, a parasitic fungus that consumes the host's life force, leaving behind a husk and spreading through the physical world. Phineas Blackwood, spirit the Vane is a cosmic entity, the eclipse, which grants an awful clarity, allowing the host to see the inherent emptiness of humanity before turning them into an instrument of chaos. It was everything everywhere. It was the ultimate principle of emptiness, using the crucible of war to find the perfect conduits. It used mental trauma to initiate the choice and biological decay to enable the spread. I stood up, the chair scraping loudly across the wooden floor. The stench of decay was now overpowering, and the air was cold. I walked over to the mirror. My reflection looked back at me, not with terror, but with a horrifying, quiet expectation. My eyes were too wide, too black, swallowing the light. My lips slowly curled into the same predatory smirk I had seen in Blackwood's blood reflection. The Vane had completed its circuit. It had chosen the historian, the man who catalogued the deaths, to carry the final, chilling truth. I was the last vessel. The mirror image reached up and traced the faint, three-pronged scratch mark that was now visible on my own skin, right across my left forearm. The invisible scar I didn't know I had. Sterling, the whisper echoed, dry and resonant, not from the mirror, but from my own throat. It is time to choose. The world has too much noise. The Vane commands silence. The voice belonged to Elias Thorne, Jasper Cole, Phineas Blackwood, and my own deepest, most repressed sense of self. I knew the final command, the ultimate act of mercy and destruction, the ending to the story that had no ending. I walked to the kitchen, my movements precise, my mind utterly still. I picked up the largest chef's knife. The reflection in the polished steel was no longer mine. It was the towering, skeletal silhouette of pure shadow. I returned to the office, raised the knife high above the complex, handwritten map I had drawn connecting all three conflicts, and brought it down hard, piercing the paper, the desk, and the narrative. I then turned to the door, my obsidian eyes focused on the innocent, sleeping life on the other side. My final command, a promise to the entity that had consumed the darkest parts of the 20th century, was a single perfect whisper. As the Vane commands, the end.